Good evening and a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Jessica and thank you so much for joining us for the launch of a new report titled No Smoke, Less Harm, which has been launched today online, but we do have copies of the executive summaries on your seats. So if you have any comments or questions about that or the report, then obviously today is the perfect time to ask those before you go home. There will be time for questions after each of the panel sessions and at the very end of the event as well. So this report and event has been brought to you by Smoke Free Sweden, which is a health advocacy group whose aim is to highlight the success of Sweden's tobacco control policies using good quality science, evidence and studies. So before we move on to Dilan, who will introduce the report, I'll present the agenda and the speaker biographies. So here's the agenda. So after Dilan introduces the No Smoke, Less Harm report at 18:20, we'll move on to panel session 1, titled The Science of No Smoke, Less Harm. And then at 7 p.m, we'll move on to panel session 2, which will focus on consumers, perceptions and politics. And then we'll have an introduction from Sueli Castro regarding a new platform that she's launched called Quit Like Sweden. And then we'll have a Q&A session briefly before we close. And then at 7:45, we'll have media interviews for any journalists that wish to speak to any of our speakers today. And then we'll have some drinks and a networking session till 8:30. So, this is our first speaker today, Dr. Konstantinos Vassilinos, who is the principal author of the report. He is a cardiologist and is the most cited e-cigarette researcher in the field. And he currently lives in Greece. So we have Dr. Carl Fagerström of Sweden, who is a clinical psychologist and is a founding member of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, and is currently a deputy editor of Nicotine and Tobacco Research. Dr. Dilan Human of South Africa and France. He is a physician, a published author, and a healthcare consultant. With Dr. Anders Milton of Sweden, who is a physician with extensive experience in public service, and he also works as a consultant in the healthcare sector. We have Professor Mihaela Raescu of Romania, who is a dentist and is a professor of dentistry at the university in Bucharest. And then Federico Fernandez, who is from Argentina. He's CEO at We Are Innovation, a global network formed by 30+ think tanks and NGOs. And Carissa During of Sweden, who is a clinical psychology student and is director of Considerate Pouches, which is a platform representing nicotine pouch users around the world. Bengt Wiberg of Sweden, who is director and founder of Sting Free Snus, which is an innovative snus product. He's a patent holder and the founder of EU for Snus, a consumer movement with members from over 100 countries. We have Patrick Stroma of Sweden, who is the Secretary General of the Swedish Snus Manufacturers and has a background in policy and advisory work. We have Daniel Wiberg, who is CEO of Sting Free Snus, and he's a trained mechanical design engineer. And then we have MP Jesper Skalberg Karlsson from Sweden, and he currently serves on both the Parliaments of the Social Committee and European Affairs Committee. And then Sueli Castro of Brazil, who is director of Quit Like Sweden, who'll introduce the platform later. So Dilan, would you like to introduce the report?
Thank you so much, Jessica, and welcome to you all to sunny Sweden. We've all come to Sweden to learn from you, and that's really what this report is about. The report is titled No Smoke, Less Harm, because in Sweden, despite the fact that Sweden has an equivalent total nicotine use than the average EU country, and actually like many other countries in the world. In Sweden, you have managed to generate much more superior public health outcomes with relation to tobacco-related disease and premature death. And the question is always why and how did you do it? Well, you used and the government allowed you to use smoke-free nicotine alternatives. That, in a nutshell, is what this report is about. But I'd like to just, before I show you some of the results in the report, just pay homage to Konstantinos. Konstantinos Varsalinos is a remarkable scientist, and he's one of the first to delve into the Eurobarometer 2020 to actually make the calculation. I remember it like yesterday when Konstantinos said, well, actually the Swedes use the same total nicotine than other countries, but they just use it more wisely. They've understood the principle of smoke-free. No smoke, less harm. And through his calculations in the EU data, which is pretty robust data, he's managed to make that quite clear. And that's what our hope is for this report, is that it would stimulate debate and that it would spur on WHO and governments to do the same calculation in their own country. Because if you can calculate the total nicotine use in a country, then you can go at the policy level to make a fundamental differentiation between smoked and smoke-free nicotine delivery systems. You can then change the misperceptions of consumers, where often consumers and physicians worldwide, and we'll have Federico speak to that later, where physicians and consumers alike, there's a gross misperception of nicotine and dangers and what really is not caused by nicotine at all. And then at a scientific level, to have more research done on total nicotine use and the actual effect at an individual and also at a population health basis. And then lastly, to make sure that innovation in new products would help to push out smoked or combustible tobacco and replace it with smoke-free nicotine alternatives. And we know that Carl here is one of the scientists, but also entrepreneurs who started one of the first oral nicotine pouch companies. So we are tremendously privileged to be part of the Swedish experience. And smoke-free Sweden should be an example to the rest of the world. And if I can just perhaps quote the one figure which is critical to understand why Sweden has been so exceptional in their tobacco control, and that is a smoking prevalence of 5.6%. So this country is approaching smoke-free status, which in health we define as more or less 5% smoking prevalence of adults smoking. And this is why today's report is so exceptionally important for you to take away, to speak to your policymakers, to speak to your scientists, your consumers, that we delve deeper and deeper into the understanding of what nicotine is and what it isn't. So in a nutshell, the problem is not nicotine, but it's the way nicotine is consumed by consumers. And the third bullet is the summary of the report. Total nicotine use in Sweden is equivalent to other countries, but because of smoke-free nicotine delivery systems, it has significantly better health outcomes in terms of tobacco-related disease and premature death. And this is the graph that Konstantinos was the brainchild of. If you look at the yellow columns, you'll see that the Swedish total nicotine use is pretty equivalent to the EU. But then if you look at the smoking prevalence in Sweden and you look at the average EU prevalence, 23%, there's a huge difference. And then if you look at the smoking attributable diseases, based on the IHME Global Burden of Disease database, you'll find that the Swedes outscore all the other countries by far. They have much less tobacco-related disease, disability, and premature death. You'll find that in your handouts and in the report as well on thr.net. Then if you look at Europe specifically, we looked at country comparisons between Sweden and Germany, Poland and Romania, and we're pleased to have Mihaela from Romania here today. You'll find that if you compare Sweden to Germany, for instance, more or less the same total nicotine use, but much fewer lung cancer deaths, which is quite predictable. Italy, the same. Poland, a very stark difference. So Poland has a much higher smoking prevalence, but if you look at 53% fewer lung cancer deaths in Sweden, it tells a story that needs to be researched. If you look at the same in France, Spain, and Ireland, the same story. You will find that there are less total deaths due to tobacco. There are less male deaths due to tobacco. In terms of lung cancer, other cancers, and then cardiovascular caused deaths, which is tobacco related, you'll find that in each case, Sweden is vastly superior in how they've enabled tobacco control to help the Swedes live a healthier life. This is a direct comparison between Sweden and Germany, and I invite you to, in this report, look at this in detail, and you'll find that what we did was the panel of authors, together with Konstantinos, we looked at very specific data in terms of health outcomes, and you'll find that between Germany and Sweden, there were fewer tobacco-related deaths, fewer total cancer deaths, fewer lung cancer deaths, fewer cardiovascular disease related to tobacco, and fewer other cancers apart from lung cancer. So that tells a story. And this is the story that Sweden needs to tell the world. And we're hoping that other platforms like Quit Like Sweden and some of the consumer groups in Europe will show this to their policymakers so that we can bring the Swedish success story outside of Sweden as well. Romania, and Mihaela is here. You see an even more dramatic difference because in Romania you have a much higher smoker prevalence of about 30%. So you'll find that total cancer deaths related to cancer, there's a big difference, cardiovascular even more, almost 60%. And then lastly, just a few of the recommendations. So just to explain the structure of the report, we've looked at nicotine as a molecule, and you'll see that in the report we've explained that this is often a misunderstood molecule. There's gross misperception about nicotine. Many doctors even think that nicotine causes cancer, and it does not. There's absolutely no evidence that it does that. It does not cause chronic disease, but it is used positively for smoking cessation and then also for some other functional reasons which we point out in the report. And then the panel of authors end with a few recommendations. Number one, that there should be an increased awareness of tobacco harm reduction as an integral part of tobacco control. And we are urging the World Health Organization to adopt tobacco harm reduction as part of its Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. We are advocating for a risk-proportionate regulatory framework for tobacco and nicotine products. We speak very strongly against nicotine misinformation and disinformation. And this is a call to action for more research, and mostly also for WHO and countries to better keep track of the data of nicotine use. You'll be surprised if you go into the WHO databases, then the Eurobarometer, which almost has some of the best data, and then at the moment the best database for the global burden of disease, the IHME database in San Francisco. But WHO's data is outdated and inadequate, and that's what we are calling on, is that for better monitoring and evaluation. So with that introduction to the report, I would like to welcome you again and thank you for your interest. And we'll now move into the second part of the science panel.
So we'll now move on to panel session 1, the science of no smoke, less harm. So my first questions go to Konstantinos. So I have questions regarding nicotine and combustion. So the report mentions extensively that nicotine is a widely misunderstood molecule. So can you explain that statement in your own words, Konstantinos?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Nicotine is a very misunderstood molecule because for several decades, the main source of nicotine intake for most of the global population was smoking. So even in scientific publications, you could see titles in studies referring to effects of nicotine, while in reality they were studying smoking. But at that time, it was the same. No one else, besides few exceptions like Sweden, which has traditionally been using snus, no one else was obtaining nicotine through any other source. That created a lot of misunderstanding and misperceptions, even among the scientific community, let alone the population. And that perpetuates and propagates until today. Characteristically, in 2017, we did a study in Greece among healthcare professionals and specific professionals working on smoking-related disease, like lung physicians, cardiologists, dentists, and the level of misperception about the contribution of nicotine on smoking-related disease was tremendous. Characteristically, for lung cancer, about 80%, a little bit more than 80% of these healthcare professionals responded that nicotine is an important, very important, or extremely important contributor on smoking-related lung cancer. And the same answers were given for the same answer for cancer in other organs and for cardiovascular disease. And we don't need any research on that. We know that the contribution of nicotine is minimal, if any. And we have so much evidence, not from laboratory studies, not from cell and animal studies, but from human epidemiological studies, many cohorts, mainly from Sweden, through the use of snus, which is not a pure nicotine product, it is a tobacco product containing nicotine. But we have so much evidence indirectly also reporting about nicotine, because we know that snus users obtain similar levels of nicotine on a daily basis to smokers. So it's pretty simple to understand that if nicotine was the main contributor to smoking-related disease, we would have seen similar adverse effects from the use of snus or any other form of nicotine product with smoking. But the difference is tremendous. And despite studies on laboratories, animals or cell studies, reporting things like development of atherosclerosis from nicotine administration to mice, these have never been translated into human effects because we have a lot of studies of snus users about their cardiovascular risk, both for myocardial infarctions and for strokes of any origin, thrombotic, hemorrhagic, even unspecified. So the evidence is clear. I don't think that we need more research in understanding a basic concept that the effect of nicotine on smoking-related disease is minimal. I wouldn't say zero, but I would, with a lot of confidence, say minimal. What we need to study is why there is so much resistance to the truth, because that's the truth. Why there is no honesty. Why a simple message that nicotine through a use of a non-combustible product is by far less harmful than nicotine obtained from a combustion product like tobacco cigarettes, why is it not accepted by the public health authorities, by the public health and the scientific community? It doesn't make sense. If you don't accept it, you're not telling the truth, because there is no doubt that this is the truth. We may discuss about the level of risk reduction for different products. And yes, we haven't quantified the level of risk reduction for many non-combustible nicotine products, with the exception of snus. Because for snus, as I said, we have long-term epidemiological studies, we have meta-analysis of epidemiological studies, so we have the highest level quality of evidence. But for other products, yes, it can be debatable. But not accepting the lower harm message is like saying that you shouldn't walk on the streets and look on both sides of the road before crossing the street. You should just stay at home forever. That's the alternative message. I also don't understand why governments, and there are several governments nowadays, are allowing legally the sales of the most lethal nicotine-containing product, which is the tobacco cigarette, and they are banning snus, the whole European Union, nicotine pouches. Many governments, like, for example, Belgium, a few months ago, Spain is about to do the same. Other countries in Southeast Asia, imagine India, the country with the highest rates of oral cancer in the world, because they are using some awful oral smokeless tobacco products there. And they kicked snus out of the country when a company tried to introduce snus into the Indian market. They also, a few years ago, 2-3 years ago, banned e-cigarettes. They banned them completely. But tobacco cigarettes and the lethal local forms of oral smokeless products, they are widely available and they are extremely cheap. It doesn't make sense. What's the message you give to society? It's not honest. It's not the truth. And we need to understand why they are afraid of telling the truth. It's a form of a risk aversion. We cannot accept any risk, which is like living in a different world, because all our daily activities have some risks, and all interventions and changes in behavior are made in order to reduce but not eliminate the risk. Take, for example, all medical procedures and medications. There is no medical procedure and no medication that is risk-free. And there are very, very few medical interventions that result in curing of diseases. Basically, we can cure only some infections, not even all of them. But for the rest of diseases, we treat a disease, which means that the patient will have the disease for the rest of his life. A patient with a myocardial infarction will have a dead part of his heart for the rest of his life. A patient with COPD will always be a COPD patient. But we are treating that. That means we are reducing the inability, the adverse consequences, the decline in quality of life, and the progression caused by the disease. This is harm reduction. So we accept harm reduction everywhere, even in medicine, which is by definition, and with very few exceptions, a harm reduction science. But we don't accept harm reduction for tobacco, for a product that is being used by 1.2 billion people in the world. So we have accepted and we are endorsing harm reduction for intravenous drug users, and there are 16 million intravenous drug users in the world. But we don't accept a harm reduction approach for a product that prematurely kills half of the 1.2 billion users. It doesn't make sense, and I think that, and that's my message, we need to be honest. It's so simple. It's that simple. We just need to be honest.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos. I'll now move on to Carl Fagerstrom. So I have a question about nicotine replacement therapies. So nicotine is known to be addictive when consumed via cigarette smoking. However, health professionals sometimes struggle to understand why nicotine replacement therapy has low levels of effectiveness when it comes to smoking cessation rates in smokers. Why do you think that nicotine replacement therapy is not as effective as might be expected?
Nicotine replacement was conceived in 1960s and entered the market, the first one in 1978. It was Switzerland. I have a story from the early 80s in United States when chewing gum 2 and 4 milligram was asked to be approved by FDA. But since nicotine was such a dangerous toxical chemical, 4 milligram could not be approved, but just the 2 milligram. So that gives you a little bit of the surrounding that nicotine was entered into. And the pharmaceutical companies, they didn't have a very strong interest to confront the regulatory bodies because they were coming the next day with another medicine and would like to be treated honestly. So therefore, the dose of the nicotine replacement products has kind of always been low. 2 and 4 milligram, the gum comes in 6 milligram. And that is not rewarding enough for many smokers. Another characteristic with so-called NRTs, that is the speed of delivery of nicotine. All abused drugs need to enter the circulation and the brain particularly fast. If it doesn't enter fast enough, the brain gets time to defend itself, so there is no subjective effect. So, and the cigarette is of course very effective there and unbeatable. The price has been higher for nicotine replacement than for the tobacco products. It has had a medical look, and there was a time when there was only to be bought in the pharmacies, and the smokers, they don't feel good about using a medicine and being diseased. Also, the flavors, the few flavors they were added to, for example, lozenges and gums, were there more actually to diminish the burning irritation of nicotine than to increase likelihood that and reinforcement. So that is also a difference. And there are a couple more, but I think that tells enough.
Yeah. And many people would say that actually nicotine and caffeine are very similar molecules. Could you please discuss that statement and maybe say in your own words what their similarities are?
There are similarities. If we go back 30, 40 years ago, both were cultural drugs. Tobacco was used by, at least among men, 50, 60% in some countries. So these were the top used cultural drugs. The similarities is also that they do not have any psychotoxicity, caffeine and nicotine, which most other drugs do have, cannabis for example. Similarity was they were also accepted in all cultures, all countries, virtually all religions, like Coca-Cola, which is interesting. That has also gone through the world, every country, every sort of culture and religion, and that's of course because it's something more than soda. There is a drug there, laced with sugar. Both had benefits to the users, usually of a cognitive art, and both had small adverse effects. That's why I think they could thrive and be so prevalent and used so often.
And it's interesting that in society, caffeine is so widely accepted and consumed on a daily basis. So why do you think caffeine is so widely accepted and nicotine is so unaccepted?
I think, as I said, there was not much difference between tobacco use and caffeine use up until a certain time. And what happened then was that tobacco industry behaved very poorly, very badly, and got a reputation that aroused hatred for many, not only users, but population at large, regulators. Another thing is that nicotine, as has been pointed out by Dr. Farsalinos, thrived in a very toxic environment, usually the cigarette, while caffeine was not in such a toxic environment at all. Passive smoking came up as one thing that was a very untoward for cigarettes. And another thing now, when we do see nicotine in in absolute pure form, like in the white pouches, that is that caffeine comes in coffee, grained coffee beans. They are brown and you put in many spoons to get a cup of coffee. The pure nicotine comes in white powder and you need a few milligrams. And white powder is also something that cocaine comes into, morphine, etc. And I think this arouses connotations and a kind of resistance in the population. So these are some of the differences.
Thank you very much. So,
Let me clarify
yeah.
something. What Carl is mentioning is reasons to explain, but not to justify the misperceptions. These reasons are not good enough to justify those kind of misperceptions. In fact, all these reasons are purely non-scientific. They have nothing to do with real evidence, and they have nothing to do with the real effects of nicotine. Unlike cocaine, heroin, and other opioids that we very frequently see that these are compared with nicotine and they appear in the same cell in a table discussing about addictiveness and addictive substances. Unlike those chemicals, nicotine is perfectly compatible with social and daily activities because it is a cognitive enhancer, unlike all other substances, including marijuana, THC, which has now been considered a pure substance that can be used recreationally by the whole population. Many governments are, one after the other, legalizing the recreational use of marijuana. Marijuana does not improve cognition. In fact, it depresses cognition. And other opioids, of course, do it in a much worse way. And they are not compatible with daily social activities. Nicotine is perfectly compatible. You can have normal, if not improved, personal life, family life, social life, professional life, while using nicotine in the same way, and that's another resemblance, in the same way when you use caffeine. So nicotine is more similar to caffeine than it is to opioid drugs that we very frequently see nicotine being compared to. It has nothing to do with opiates. Opiates do not improve. In fact, they depress cognition. They have other very adverse effects, and they are not compatible with daily life, social life, and activities. So there shouldn't be any discussion comparing nicotine with opioids. We should be comparing it with caffeine, with the exception of tobacco cigarettes, of course. But again, and that's my message, Carl mentioned several reasons to explain, but not to justify the misperceptions that exist in society, within the public health community, and within the regulatory authorities.
May I throw in a torch
Yes,
here, 10
yes, of course.
seconds?
Yeah.
It's interesting in the US, if you look at the prevalence of tobacco use, it's ticking down year by year. If you look at the prevalence of cannabis use, it's ticking up year by year. And it looks to be two very good communicating yards. Is that good for public health?
Thank you. We now move on to Dilon, and you mentioned briefly earlier that the total nicotine use in Sweden is actually very similar compared with other EU countries. So why, in your own words, then, are public health outcomes so much better in Sweden when it comes to tobacco control?
Simply because it's not measured. The calculation of total nicotine use was measured by Konstantinos and this panel of authors. And that's really our call, is for governments to perhaps stop criticizing and allowing misinformation on nicotine and at least measure the active molecule in their populations, and then specifically to differentiate between combustible forms of nicotine delivery and smoke-free, because that should then inform better evidence-based policy making. So that really is the call of this whole report. It is not because governments do not understand that there's a difference, but if you look at Sweden, we have 40 years, as Konstantinos mentioned, we have 40 years of very solid evidence of how nicotine has been consumed in this country, much better health outcomes, and still other countries do not want to follow suit. It makes no sense. And to me as a physician, I have to say this is also why I fully understood harm reduction the first time, is when I studied the Swedish data. Most physicians think of nicotine as part of tobacco, and they don't differentiate between nicotine and tobacco. And this is the moment where we hope that this report and ongoing advocacy will wake up governments, will wake up physicians, will wake up health professionals so that they ask the right questions.
And I have a question about regulation of alternative products. What is it, do you think, the Swedes have done which is different to other EU countries, which in terms of providing a risk proportionate regulatory system to allow these products to be on the market for people that wish to switch from cigarettes?
I think Anders would also say that tobacco control in Sweden is a very pragmatic framework, and it's not as if the government is all for smoke-free nicotine alternatives. But what the government has done right in Sweden is they have enabled and allowed for smoke-free nicotine to be consumed in an affordable, accessible, and acceptable way for consumers in Sweden. And that's why they also engaged with the EU and made sure that that the EU ban on snus was not applied to Sweden, because this is a part of the cultural phenomenon in Sweden. And that's really what we are calling for in the report as well. Is for nicotine to be made affordable, available, and accessible to consumers in a smoke-free delivery system.
Thank you. Now we move on to Anders. So I have a question about ethics and public health leadership. So the report states that the ethical aspects of harm reduction have been largely left out when it comes to tobacco control. As a physician and public health leader yourself, you would agree that ethics needs to be central in the consideration of the inclusion of tobacco harm reduction in tobacco control. The question is, how can ethics support tobacco harm reduction through no smoke, less harm?
Thank you. Thank you very much for posing that question. I think that it's obvious, I mean, at least in Sweden, that the health agencies in Sweden are basically run by the World Health Organization. They're not run by the Swedish government, because they have different opinions when it comes to harm reduction. You know, we are all talking about harm reduction. We're saying that snus is much better for you than, it's a dependence, obviously, but it's much better for you than smoking cigarettes. You don't get cancer from snus. You don't get cancer from nicotine. But if you ask my colleagues, the doctors in Sweden, or in Romania, or in Greece, they would tell you that you probably get cancer from nicotine. That's wrong. You don't get cancer from nicotine. I think, unfortunately, the powers that be, the European Union and the World Health Organization, they have decided that tobacco, regardless of how you get it, is dangerous and should be stopped. And they are trying to outlaw all other forms of tobacco than the cigarette. And I guess they will then try to make cigarettes not known, as it were, to mankind. They want to stop smoking, but they want to go through the cigarettes first. And I think it's wrong. Because a lot of people apparently, about 23% of the Swedish male population uses snus every day. It's about the same as the figures for the rest of the European Union. I mean, people get a kick of nicotine, and we should allow that kick to be had. I mean, Germany today or a few weeks ago allowed cannabis, which is much more dangerous than cigarettes, than tobacco or snus. And I don't understand. I think there is no ethics in forbidding the most harmless products that there are. I think we should do that more. We should accept the harmless products. and and get the governments of the world and the World Health Organization and the European Union to understand that. That's our task.
Thank you. And I have a question for Mihaela. So I have a question about oral cancer risk. With your experience as a dentist, do you see any evidence that alternative products actually cause oral cancer?
Okay, I don't know exactly if any alternative will cause oral cancer. I cannot be sure of that, because in Romania we have the alternatives only a few years ago. They are coming on the market. And what I can tell you is that I'm not a smoker, I've never been. I'm teaching the students oral prevention, so I can help them by showing just one example, a smoker tongue, for example, with the question, will you kiss somebody like this with such a halitosis, with such appearance? And after that, this is the point where you can start and you can explain that for an adult smoker, if you cannot reach cessation, then you can use some alternatives. This is the point where they can have this kind of education, let's say, because if they have to learn about nicotine, first of all, they have to be informed. The most reliable advice to our patients, to our people, to everybody is coming from the doctor. Is it true? I think, no? So if you rely on this advice, and you know what it's all about, you can take care of yourself. But the doctors are not informed, so we have to educate them. And that's why it's a problem in Romania. We have so many million of cigarette smokers because they are not informed, not even the doctors. And about risk present in alternative products. I studied some oral effects when switching from cigarette smokers to heat-not-burn. And I saw myself, so nobody will convince me of the contrary, that the bacterial plaque is decreasing after switching to heat-not-burn products. So the bacterial plaque means inflammation, and the base of all diseases, it's inflammation. So less bacterial plaque, less inflammation, less oral problems. And I can tell you also that oral problems mean entire body problems. So I don't know exactly if any alternative could cause oral cancer, but for sure, using the alternatives is less risky than using the combustible cigarette. And also, it is a problem of decreasing inflammation, it is a success, and that's why it's recommended to switch if you cannot reach cessation, for an adult, of course.
So I have a question about regulation. So the report states that for smoke-free nicotine alternatives to be an effective harm reduction and tobacco cessation public health strategy, a robust and risk-proportionate regulatory framework is a requirement. What are your thoughts on this statement?
I think that for tobacco harm reduction to be successful, all of the market participants and the public health actors must have clear understanding of comparative harm between cigarettes and reduced risk products such as heat-not-burn, snus, or nicotine pouches. And scientists and public health actors, including doctors, are the most important non-industry stakeholders in accelerating tobacco harm reduction measures through risk proportional regulation. A continued education on the best available science is needed, and the most important thing is the doctors must be protected from retaliatory measures if they speak up about harm reduction, because they are afraid to speak about harm reduction. They are afraid to speak about nicotine. They are afraid to speak about how you can prevent the disease, the oral health disease. And if they start speaking about this, they can speak in congresses, and just keep in mind that all the doctors are informed by what they hear in congresses, in scientific literature. So if you stop them for speaking, from speaking, you can stop them also for being informed. And as I told you, this is the problem. They are not informed, they cannot inform the patient, so that means continuing smoking, so less cessation, so less alternative products. If you don't know, you don't use it. If you know, you are informed, so you can make your choice. So, for example, you know that you eat sugar, and it's not good for your health. If the doctor is telling you, don't eat sugar, it's up to you if you start using an alternative to sugar tomorrow, or if you are using again sugar in your with problems for your health. So this is the main issue, to be informed, and all the patient and the doctor will make a choice, a very good one. Sweden made a very good one. So this is why it's so valuable, this report, because it gives information to all the doctors and to all the people that want to be informed in this.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, you ask, and I'm going to joke a little bit, but you're asking the question of risk proportional regulation as if we are reinventing the wheel. Well, in reality, risk proportional regulation is what politicians apply for everything they regulate. So the higher the risk, the more the restrictions, the taxes, the bans. The lower the risk, the lower the restrictions. For example, many countries have reduced or even do not apply any VAT in helmets. The UK, for example, the UK government, there is no VAT for helmets. I've never heard of any government saying that because helmets normalize motorcycle use and motorcycle use is more dangerous than driving a car, let's double the price of helmets so that we will not encourage anyone to buy a helmet and use a motorcycle. Well, you're laughing at that, but that's exactly what many governments do concerning harm reduction products. They apply more restrictions, they add taxes in products that are already more expensive, some of them, which are technology products, are by definition, the production cost is higher compared to producing tobacco cigarettes, but they are adding more restrictions, they're adding more taxes, they make these products less accessible, while at the same time you can get cigarettes within walking distance wherever you are. So it doesn't make sense at all. So don't laugh with my example of helmets, because it's very similar to what we're doing with tobacco harm reduction. But we're not laughing at it. It costs lives, especially in countries, and that's even more strange, that countries which have very limited resources devoted to smoking cessation are the countries which are implementing most of the bans. And it makes no sense, because they don't have any other alternative. They cannot provide to the population smoking cessation services. I can bring the example of India, of Indonesia, 60% smoking rate among men in Indonesia, 65% tax on e-cigarettes. Doesn't make sense. They're more expensive than cigarettes. It makes no sense. I was in Indonesia once several years ago, and I was speaking to some regulators, and their concern was that there are kids who will initiate vaping. And if you go on YouTube, you will see 7-year-old kids from Indonesia smoking. So I showed him a video on YouTube of an Indonesian kid smoking at the age of 5 or 7, smoking like crazy, like a long-standing smoker. And I said, this is your problem. And you're talking about e-cigarettes being used by some kids based on some anecdotes. and you have your smoking problem on YouTube, on display. They don't seem to get it. And I need to emphasize what Anders said about the WHO overreach. It's an overreach, a dishonest overreach that doesn't make sense. But it is so persuasive because for many people and many governments, WHO is perceived as some sort of a religion. And they get persuaded by things that don't make sense, that are completely irrational. India was congratulated for their decision to ban e-cigarettes. Before the ban, you couldn't find e-cigarette products anywhere in India. You needed to search quite a lot to find a vapor. You couldn't see people vaping on the streets. After the ban, India has been flooded by black market illicit products of unknown origin and unknown, of course, quality. In every street, in every corner of every street of every major city in India, you will now find e-cigarettes being sold by any sort of person you can imagine, not by vape shops. And the government pretends that they don't exist because they have banned them, but not only have they banned the product, they have prohibited research on the product. So they have banned scientists from doing any sort of research on the product in India. Officially, that's not unofficial. There is an announcement by the government that you're not allowed to do research on e-cigarettes. And now the country is flooded with black market products. No one knows where they come from. There is no quality criteria. There is no control by the government, nothing. So they pretend they don't exist, and they are everywhere now. So they created a problem that they didn't have before with no regulation. So the regulation that they introduced caused the problem, but they still don't get it. And they are still being congratulated by the WHO. Makes zero sense. Makes zero sense. The WHO announced a few years ago that Syria has a big problem with smoking. At the peak of the war, of the civil war in Syria, the WHO was concerned about the smoking rates in Syria. If that's not an example of a totally unrealistic and unreasonable approach, I don't know what kind of an example you can consider that, let alone that they also congratulated North Korea, of course, but that's another story, I mean. But yeah, that's the truth, you know. That's the truth. Doesn't make sense. We need to be more honest, as I said.
Thank you, Konstantinos. Are there any questions in the room for any of our panelists? Or any online questions? Let me check on my phone. Okay. Oh, you have one. Yep.
Hi, my name is Matthias. With the quite big possibility of making myself look like an idiot, but my mom said it's better to ask a question and look stupid than not to ask and remain stupid. So I'll ask. And I think, Carl, you alluded to it, but when looking at that, I haven't seen the full report. The second-hand smoke, is that counted into the numbers that we see in the report? Or is that an additional, or is there such a thing as second-hand smoke that could cause cancer?
There probably is, but what we've seen from the Swedish example is that we have the lowest incidence for lung cancer within the European Union. We are lower than the average of the European Union countries. And not because we don't use tobacco, but we use snus instead of smoking. And so it will be the same, you know, in effect, that the number of people affected by secondary smoking, which is not probably good for you, the number of people affected by that will be lower since there are so few smokers. Again, the Swedish government has not done anything that other governments have done. They have done the same thing. It's just that people have accepted the fact that it's better to use snus. You can live with the snus, but you die from cigarettes.
Well, second-hand smoking is a problem it's not the same way that it was before, because over so many years, governments have correctly regulated against the use of, for example, smoking in public closed places. Although I think there is an overreach now, for example, governments banning smoking on the parks. It doesn't protect anyone. That's ridiculous government overreach for nothing. But second-hand smoking was more of the problem in the past. And I mean 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, before implementing the closed space bans. Now, it's not that much of a problem. Of course, with snus, you don't have any second-hand exposure. Even with e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products, the second-hand exposure is, we're talking about minimal traces of non-combustible byproducts, like, for example, aldehydes. But to be honest, when I measured aldehydes in electronic cigarettes, I found that just by sitting in your house and do nothing but breathe the air in your house, you get 5 to 6 times more formaldehyde than you get from vaping all day at a rate of 5 grams of liquid per day, which is the average consumption for vapers. So there has been a lot of discussion about second-hand exposure. Yes, with smoking it exists, not so much with the other products, nothing with snus. But today it's not the main problem causing tobacco-related disease. There are some data sets which consider second-hand smoking separately. Other data sets include them into the tobacco-related deaths. But in Sweden, when you look at males data, the data are even stronger, because it's one of the very few countries where male smoking rates are lower than female smoking rates. And this is also because of snus and not because of the paternity leave that lawyers in the European Court mentioned. I mean, this is why the legal science sometimes makes jokes on science, because this is ridiculous for science, supporting that it's the paternity leave that resulted in lower smoking rates among men in Sweden. Doesn't make any sense at all. It's just legal games to justify the EU ban. But forget second-hand exposure. It's not a big part of tobacco-related deaths. Most is coming from direct exposure, let's be honest. And there are problems with the data set. There are problems, especially in some countries which don't have a very good recording system of deaths. And of course, you need to take into consideration other factors too. But the global burden of disease reports specifically the risk factor. So it reports number of deaths due to tobacco. It's not only total number of deaths that we're talking about. We're talking about number of deaths due to tobacco as recorded by some authorities, which the database is not perfect, but we don't have any other kind of data to use. So we have to use them. But the big problem is, and we discussed it with Delon because we wanted to make the comparison with other countries outside Europe too. It was impossible, because in order to measure total nicotine use, you need to have the raw data from the surveys. Why? Because if you add smoking, snus, e-cigarette, heated tobacco products use, you will risk overestimating nicotine use, because you have dual users. You have people who smoke and vape at the same time, people who smoke and use heated tobacco products, or even people who use snus and other nicotine products. So you cannot just add percentages. You need to have the raw data and consider each of the dual or multi-user as one nicotine user, because in reality it's one nicotine user. So you need to exclude dual or multiple use. And we could do that only because of the Eurobarometer, because the Eurobarometer releases the raw data, the data set, so you can make any kind of calculations and analysis you can by using the raw data. And I want to emphasize what Delon said. We need to ask governments to either release data sets themselves in order to be able for us scientists to make these calculations, or consider not only separately reporting each product use, but also look at total use of one substance, which is nicotine. And of course, separately report different types of products and sources of nicotine, because it's very important. But they should start discussing about total nicotine use versus the source of nicotine, what kind of product they're using. But the results from Eurobarometer are astonishing, because there is no other country that has an alternative source of nicotine at such a high rate as Sweden. It's a unique case within the European Union.
Thank you very much. That was a really great question and a really useful answer. I just have one final question online. So this person is asking, besides nicotine being a cognitive benefit, why is nicotine shunned when many people who have mental health challenges or those with Alzheimer's disease or schizophrenia tend to be those who smoke as well? As those with mental health challenges do benefit from the emotional regulations from nicotine use, we have much safer forms of nicotine delivery now, such as nicotine vapes, snus, or oral nicotine. So compared to combustible nicotine forms, why is society so against nicotine in these safer forms? Who would like to answer that in 1 minute? No pressure.
I could begin. I suppose that as smoking is pressed down more and more, it congregates in the disadvantaged people, low socioeconomic standards and problems. And I think that we see more and more self-medication with nicotine. It's not only so that everyone has a full-fledged diagnosis of depression or attention deficit or whatever. If we include subclinical problems here, there is self-medication. And for schizophrenics, for example, it's very clear that it's self-medication. They are bombarded by stimulation, so they need to increase their attention and gate out stimulation. And nicotine helps them with the gating response, so they can keep stimulation outside and not having it entering. For schizophrenics, there is also clearly more than in non-schizophrenics that there is a different connectivity in the brain. The glia cells are endangered by schizophrenia, and nicotine seems to improve the connectivity. And there are several other, for example, the treatment for some of the symptoms, the medications are, adverse effects of the medications are reduced by nicotine, and there are positive effects, particularly on the negative symptoms with nicotine. So,
basically, I mean, if you forbid smoking in the general hospital, you also forbid smoking in a psychiatric hospital. Simple as that. You treat the two as they were one.
Okay. Thank you, Anders. I think we'll end panel session 1 there. Thank you very much. Round of applause for our speakers, please. Can we please have our panel 2 members come on? So that is Carissa, Bengt, Patrick, and Daniel. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's fine. Thank you. Right. Thank you. Go there, Carissa. There we go. Perfect. Is Federico online? Perfect. Right, so we'll start with Federico Fernandez from We Are Innovation. Hello, Federico.
Hello, Jessica, and hello, everyone. It's a
Hello.
pleasure to be with you through these times, this distance this time.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Federico. So your team at We Are Innovation conducted a survey on Swedish consumers. Can you please show a few slides to summarize the top-line findings of the research that you conducted last year?
Yes, happily, if somebody at your team can help me with the slides, I'll show them and discuss them very, very quickly.
Yep, here we go. Can you see that?
Great, yes, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, I'll start and I'll try to be as quickly as possible. As Jessica said, I'm Federico Fernandez, CEO of We Are Innovation. We are a network of more than 40 think tanks and NGOs that believe in the power of innovation of human creativity. If you want to know about our work, please visit weareinnovation.global. And I really want to thank Dylan, Jessica, and Lucy for the invitation and congratulate them for the great work that they are doing promoting the Swedish experience, the report that they presented today that I think is extremely important. And I'm very honored to be online this time, being part of the presentation of this report and being part of this event. If we can go to the next slide. As Jessica mentioned, last year, we commissioned Ipsos to do a poll to find out what ex-smokers who switched to safer alternatives thought, Swedish ex-smokers. So this is what I'm going to present you, but you can find the full study on our website. Please remember that because I'm going to show you just a couple of slides. Let's go to the next slide, please. And something we all need to remember, and this is what gathers us today, and I always like to, and I really like this picture, by the way, Sweden is winning. And Sweden is winning because Sweden, we believe, it's using both innovation and, let's say, sound policies in order to fight smoking. And in a way, with the poll, we wanted to find out what was the perspective of those who walked this path, let's say, people who were smokers and changed and switched into safer alternatives. Let's go to the next slide, please. The first reason that people told us that made them switch to alternative nicotine products was health. And this is, let's say, this is, in a way, this is obvious probably for everybody who's here and for everybody who's watching here and will watch this in the online, at least in the near future. This is quite obvious. Unfortunately, this is not the case in general, and many smokers, and by the way, today we published a new Ipsos poll regarding this that we did in 28 different countries. Currently, smokers think that, in general, smokers think that vaping is as or more harmful than vaping. So there's a lot that we can do. Incidentally, by the way, in Sweden, we found out that for women also social aspects are more important than for men. Let's go to the next slide, please. We also highlighted, and I'll go in a little bit more of detail regarding women in the next slide, that one of the secrets you could say about the Swedish experience is that there is variety. And this, I think, it's a very interesting feature of the Swedish model. In that country, let's say they avoided somehow a one-size-fits-all policy that would have been problematic, definitely, as it usually is, regardless of where it's applied. And that, let's say, the four alternative nicotine products that basically exist today are legal in Sweden and have a relatively sound regulatory framework. I think it testifies that. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I always like to say that it's true that in Sweden, snus is king, but if there were a queen is nicotine pouches, in the sense that snus, and probably because of how it was historically, let's say the first iteration of snus is it's probably not the best looking or smelling product. Sorry, Patrick. Snus was never very much something tempting for women, and nicotine pouches, which are, by the way, the newest and most modern product, is definitely more appealing for women. And again, this shows that it's important to avoid these one-size-fits-all policies. And let's go to almost my last slide. Another very important factor that our poll showed is that for women, the issue, for instance, of nicotine levels is more important than for men. For instance, 35% of women said that this was very important, against 23% of men, and the same with flavors. Half of the women that we polled said that this, let's say, have variety of flavors was very important, while only 37% of men said the same. Again, let's say Sweden has avoided the one-size-fits-all approach. In this, Sweden has respected gender sensitivities. Sweden has allowed innovators to do what they do best, which is improving our lives. And the results of this is that a lot of people in Sweden are going to have longer and more fruitful lives. I think this is a very good deal on my book. I would take this deal every day of the week and twice on Sunday. And this is what I wanted to share with you. If you want to know more about what we do and check the full study, go to weareinnovation.global. And again, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Federico. I just have one question regarding the findings. In your view, which is probably the most standout or the most important finding regarding these perceptions that then has demonstrated why Sweden's public health outcomes are better than other EU countries? Do you have any thoughts on the standout finding from that research, just to summarize for our audience?
I mean, this is a very important, this is a very interesting question, Jessica. Let's, in trying to be brief, I think that from this Swedish poll, we basically extracted the idea that if you check what ex-smokers are saying, the secret sauce of Sweden is that these products are acceptable, accessible, and affordable. And that's definitely a key point for us. And the second one is what I mentioned earlier at the beginning, because it's something that it should be obvious, but unfortunately, thanks to some terrorizing misinformation that has spread too much, it's not the case, which is in Sweden, people who smoke in general switch because of health reasons. And let's say this is quite obvious, and everybody at the first panel basically explained us that. But what we have shown in our latest poll is that smokers all over the world don't think that, for instance, vaping is less harmful than smoking. So this is a very important issue and also a very important finding. And I think it shows why Sweden took the direction that it took, why people, individuals in Sweden took and made took the direction and made the decisions that they made, and why so many smokers all over the world are not following the Swedish, let's say, way.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move on to Carissa, who is the director of Considerate Pouches Consumer Group in Sweden. So Carissa, as the leader of this group, can you briefly introduce the group, its mission, and what it has achieved since its inception?
Yes. Let me start off and say, give a great thank you for this report. It's a very useful tool for us that are working with advocacy and getting the information out there. So I am the director of Considerate Pouchers in Sweden, and Considerate Pouchers is a global consumer group or a consumer network that are working to assure this, that our safer alternative nicotine pouches is available and accessible all around the world. And the aim is to have advocates in all countries that can help mobilize consumers and also inform consumers about what is going on in their country regarding nicotine pouches. So ultimately, what we want to make sure is to make sure that consumers' voice is heard and that it is listened to by policymakers. The UN has a motto which is nothing about us without us, which means that no policy should be decided without the direct and full participation of the groups that are affected by that policy. And this is standard in very many fields and very logical. I mean, if you want to legislate surrounding, say, a mental health illness, like you want to do a reform, then you will listen to those that actually have this illness and listen to what they need. And that is usually given, but when it comes to this field, consumers are unfortunately not listened to enough. And it's important to remember that it's not only the nicotine pouch consumers or the vapors, it's also the 1.2 billion smokers in the world that are also affected by these policies that could benefit from knowing that there are safe alternatives to switch to.
Yeah. We know that there is an issue with misinformation in tobacco harm reduction. There are in many areas of harm reduction. So how do you support adult consumers worldwide in terms of giving them accurate information on the differences in risk linked to each tobacco and nicotine product category? You know, how do you support them through that?
First and foremost, we are trying to inform through our channels, our social media, our website, and through our public campaigns that we are doing. But what we would really like to see is that governments take the initiative and an active approach in actually informing consumers about the safer alternatives. Because this is what would really tip the scales of changing the information and the knowledge in the public. For example, during the pandemic, governments spend hundreds of millions on informing consumers or informing the public that taking the vaccine might have some risk, but it's still vastly safer than not taking the vaccine and then going out and catching COVID. So if governments would have the same approach to this issue, that would have a huge effect. And I mean, it doesn't even have to cost a lot. What if on cigarette packages we would put, for example, nicotine pouches and vapes are much safer alternatives to smoking? This is the audience, the group that we want to target. So this is what we really mainly focus on to make sure that these policymakers listen to this, because that's where the big change can be made. It's through the governments.
Thank you very much, Carissa. That's really great work that Considerate Pouches are doing. Congratulations. So now we move on to Bengt. So you recently carried out a survey of 1,000 plus adult snus and nicotine pouch users in Sweden, who answered a total of 23 questions regarding snus and nicotine pouch use, including their habits and attitudes. Additionally, more than 2,000 users who signed up for the Sting-Free newsletter were asked to answer a few questions about their oral health. Can you please summarize the methodology and the results and the conclusions? Your slides.
Right.
Yeah.
We start with a little rehearsal. The Swedish experience is quite amazing, with 5.6% daily smokers only. And we have the same average nicotine use as the European Union. And in Sweden, we don't smoke, more or less, but we use other nicotine products like snus, nicotine pouches, and e-cigarettes. I'm Bengt Wiberg. There was talk about innovation here before, and I'm happy to be the involuntary inventor of the Sting-Free snus technology. It started many years ago. I had so much pain in my gum, and when I lifted my lip, I got scared. So I went to my dentist on an emergency, and he told me, Bengt, you have to quit snus. And at this time, e-cigarettes were hardly not known in Sweden. So my other option would be to get my nicotine from cigarettes. And I have quit smoking in 1991. So I came up with this crazy idea to put a Band-Aid, a patch, on my snus pouch and placed the protective side against my sore gums, and the pain disappeared immediately. And the next time I came to my dentist, he said, Bengt, I can see you quit using snus. We are a small company. Daniel is the CEO of Sting-Free AB, and I'm the founder. I'm also the founder of the EU for Snus movement. Snus, all oral nicotine products can have effects in the oral cavity. One of these is the stinging sensation and gum irritation, and also can have permanent effects on the gum. But let's carry on. We did a survey by putting 2 adverts on Facebook and Instagram, inviting adult snus or nicotine pouch users to answer quite amazing 23 questions, and we got about 1,050 replies. So we asked the consumers about their habits when they use snus and their attitudes, and also if they had experienced any problems. So let's have a look.
Next slide.
Yes, this came first. What you can see on the far right is this is a relative risk scale made by Dr. Rachel Murkett in 2022, showing that the risk of smoking cigarettes is the biggest risk you can take. It's the biggest preventable cause of death in the world, where some 8 million people die prematurely due to smoking. Looking on the low risk scale, we have snus, we have nicotine replacement therapy, we have e-cigarettes, and we have non-tobacco pouches, which is nicotine pouches. And it has been mentioned before by Konstantinos and others that nicotine in itself, anyone can Google this question and you'll get, within 2 seconds, you get the answer, no, nicotine in itself does not cause cancer. So let's get into the survey results. We had 37% of the 1,050 respondents were women, and quite evenly distributed in age, with an overrepresentation of 18 to 24-year-olds. Let's carry on. Now, you wonder, why is this issue such a big issue? Well, we have proven in my company that the myth that it's supposed to sting, it's supposed to burn when you use these products, and that everybody loves it and you get used to it. This is false, because these respondents, 2/3 of the women and more than 50% of the men, find the stinging sensation unpleasant. And looking at the other end of the curve, those who love the stinging sensation is 18% of the men and about 12% of the women. And these are persons using snus or nicotine pouches. So imagine, I think people who are using these products, if they have been abroad, have asked a foreigner who smokes, will you try a snus? And then you laugh because they get a little bit dizzy in the head, and then they say, ow, it hurts, and they remove it. So the stinging sensation, in our opinion, is a big barrier, a deterrent for smokers to switch to these safer products. We carry on. Does these participants worry about their oral health in connection with use and nicotine pouches? 2/3 of the women have worried during 2021 about their oral health, and almost half of the men. We carry on.
Can you finish soon, Bengt? Can you finish soon?
Let's skip this one. This is if these users have get the ban from the dentist.
Okay.
Let's carry on. These are some typical problems that may occur when using snus or nicotine pouches. Snus lesions, which is benign, they disappear if you quit all use. And we carry on. The sting-free technology pouch has a blue protective side for the gum, but it still allows nicotine and flavors to pass through the white part. This, we are also not only asking consumers, we are also in contact with dentists, Dr. Matthias Ahl sitting there, and Mihaela. This is a dentist who's been snus using for 15 years. He's about 40 to 44 years old. We did tests with snus using dentists, and the picture on the left shows a snus lesion in the oral mucous membrane, and after 5 weeks with this product that has a barrier for the gum, the snus lesion has completely disappeared. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bengt. Is Jesper Karlsson online? Perfect. We'll go to MP Jesper Karlsson of Sweden. Let's see if we can see him.
Can you hear me at least?
Hi, Jesper. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Hi,
perfectly fine.
great. We can see you. Perfect. Thank you so much for giving up your time to speak to us today. Can you please provide your thoughts on the state of tobacco policy in Sweden versus other EU countries?
Sweden has for a long time been very successful in mitigating the smoking of tobacco on a daily basis regarding cigarettes and the like. We have huge warning labels on the packs. We have a high tax, and we have banned smoking in any place that serves alcohol, both indoors and outdoors. So I think when it comes to regulating cigarettes and smoking tobacco on the daily, we have been successful. At the same time, we have a long history of the Swedish snus, which of course, some politicians have wanted to regulate and ban at different times, but consumers in Sweden are very keen on keeping using snus for the cultural aspect and also for the health benefits. A lot of people have used snus to stop smoking. So at the same time that we are trying to become a smoke-free country, we are also looking into making sure that there are safer alternatives on the market, and I think that's why we're here today.
Yeah. And how can we as advocates better inform politicians about the facts regarding safer alternatives so that they will listen to the evidence? What's your words of advice?
I think it's very important to be very straightforward with the facts. If you provide safer alternatives and make sure that people aren't smoking cigarettes, you get less people contract cancer and tobacco-related illnesses, which means a smaller burden on healthcare workers. It means that people live longer lives, which means they can go to work for longer, which means a higher GDP. And also the most important thing, we are right now heading into European elections. And if the whole of the union were to smoke as little as we do in Sweden, we could save around 2.5 million lives per year. So if politicians are ignoring those facts, they are both ignorant and, if I may say so, kind of heartless. And I think that leads the way to making sure that people that politicians really care about are well informed, and that's the voters, to make sure that voters are well informed so that politicians cannot ignore them.
Do you have any other words of advice for consumer groups or any other advocacy groups in terms of how they could amplify how influential they can be at that level of politics?
I think a lot of great things are happening. I can see that you have Carissa in the panel, and I think that consumers coming together, being creative and making sure that their opinions are heard are very vital for democracy. And I also think that it's great to see that these groups are popping up and forming in different countries, because it's very easy in the political debates to get stuck in a trap where it's, you know, health advocates versus the tobacco and nicotine companies. They are somewhat clumped together, which is very unfortunate. So I think consumer groups are very important, and also to make sure that experts like Carl Fagerström in Sweden is heard also on an international level, because if people don't listen to other politicians, then at least they can listen to the scientists.
Thank you very much. Very well said. Lots of support in the room. Thank you very much. We can move on to Daniel Viberg now. So going back to the role of innovation, and you're a design mechanical engineer working for Sting-Free Snus, you're in the innovation space. Do you have some advice for small companies looking to introduce innovations in the harm reduction space, and what kind of challenges do they face and what could they overcome?
Well, I have a lot of first-hand experience of running a small company trying to change a big industry. Very sound advice I would give to anyone, to the people in this room trying to change an industry is don't give up, and make sure you're working with a crazy optimist who will not, you know, back down from big companies telling you that, yeah, your idea is wrong, this isn't what consumers want. I would urge you to look for help in academia. We've certainly had good assistance from there, from people in this room. People who like facts are happy to discuss your technical idea, and will do so just because they find it interesting. So that is very sound advice I would give. And yeah, don't give up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well said. We'll now move on to Patrick of Sweden. And I have a question regarding the history and the role of snus and how that's played a very important role in the public health journey in Sweden. So how important is the role of snus in this public health story?
Oh, it's extremely important. First, I would like to apologize. I represent the industry, the big companies. And I'm a very non-commercial person, so I have no idea what people want or what people like. I can just look at the facts and the history. So snus was invented more than 200 years ago, and it's tobacco, salt and water, and Swedes put it under the lip. And it was very practical because you could use both your hands and do the hard work on an everyday basis on farms, sailors, railroad workers. But when the cigarette came, snus was regarded as rural, backwards, only for poor people. And for decades, the snus consumption in Sweden actually decreased year by year until the 1970s. And then the first reports of lung cancer and the connection to cigarette smoking appeared. And also, talking about inventions, the tobacco pouch was invented, and that was a game changer because the real snus is very unpractical. It's dirty and it's not good for your teeth, or at least the color of your teeth. But with the tobacco pouch, Swedish men started to quit smoking. Men and women had the same regulation, the same taxes, the same restrictions, the same health warnings on packages. And in 1980, more men than women smoked in Sweden. But with the invention, the Swedish male population started to quit smoking at a much higher pace than ever before. So for many decades, Sweden was the only country in the European Union where women smoked more than men. And when the nicotine pouches entered the market, the women began to catch up with the men. So now we have two smoke-free generations in Sweden. The youngest up to 29 years old, and the middle-aged, 30 to 44. And the middle-aged men, 30 to 44, was the first single group to become smoke-free. Less than 5% daily smokers. At the same time, around 24% of them used snus on a daily basis. So for me, it's quite clear, not to say obvious, that pouches and snus as an option for smokers will decrease smoking. There's no doubt about it. So both the tradition, but mainly the inventions, because the inventions changed the game completely. And then we had the European Union snus ban in 1992 and the Swedish membership with the exemption. And that also created a kind of national pride around snus in a way that I do not remember we actually had before. And after that, science has gone further, and the difference between smoking combustible cigarettes and using nicotine in a less harmful way has been more clear as well.
Thank you, Patrick, for those really interesting points. In the interest of time, we'll spend the next 5 minutes taking questions from the floor for any of our panel members who are on stage or in the room on their chairs. So are there any questions in the room? Mihaela. Thank you. And please speak into the microphone. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. We are lucky to use oral alternatives for cigarette smokers because we can prevent every disease and every lesion that can appear in the oral cavity. Is it true? Yes. So is it not so visible when we have problems in lungs level, I don't know, liver or let's say cardiovascular diseases, because they are visible very late. So we are lucky that we can prevent the diseases immediately when they appear in the oral cavity, so we can reduce oral cancer. As Banks said, he was advised by the dentist to stop immediately the use of the pouch when he saw a lesion. So I am asking you, did you find somebody who said, I'm not going to smoke again, I'm not using any alternatives, anything, so he reached or she reached cessation after this kind of, let's say, using alternatives like the oral pouches or oral snus?
Thank you for the question, Michaela. I'm sure I'm a stubborn guy, and when my dentist told me you have to quit using snus, my dentist obviously did not consider the consequences. If I didn't come up with the idea to solve my own problems, I would probably have gone back to smoking, because I am nicotine dependent, I admit it, but I've been using since 1991 a considerably safer form, which is snus and nicotine pouches. And if I didn't make it clear, but when we looked at the relative risk scale, you found that snus and nicotine pouches were just a fraction of the risk compared to smoking. So when we're talking oral lesions, which disappear when you quit using snus, and other oral health problems, of course, they are minimal as compared to lung cancer and oral cancer and cardiovascular diseases. Thank you.
Thank you. So we do actually have a question online from somebody regarding packaging, which is interesting. It might be best placed to Bengt or Daniel or Carl. So what lessons can we take from Sweden in terms of packaging when it comes to oral nicotine pouches for a country like Kenya that seeks to include graphic images similar to those on cigarettes?
Well, I can throw my hat in the ring and say, I think packaging is important. I mean, looking at Sweden, obviously here there are very few limitations on pouch packaging. Currently there is actually more limitations on nicotine pouches than tobacco snus, where it just says, you know, the warnings for nicotine. Looking at other countries, our neighboring countries, there are plain packaging. Cigarette packaging in Sweden, as has been mentioned, is the same as other countries with graphic images, which, looking globally, lots of countries have those images, and their smoking prevalence is still very high. So in the interest of looking at facts, I would urge legislators not to interfere in terms of plain packaging and instead focus on making the more safe products easily recognizable as more safe.
Right, just 1 minute, Bengt. Thank you, Daniel.
I could probably just add, I agree with Daniel, but I know for a fact that in Nigeria, which is one of the biggest countries in Africa, there are labels in cigarette packs stating that smokeless tobacco is less harmful than continuous smoking, which corresponds to what you said, which is this fabulous free of charge idea how to move people away from deadly smoking to less harmful products.
Thank you very much, Bengt. Right, last but not least, we have Sueli Castro. Would you like to come up from Brazil, who'll talk about Quit Like Sweden? Thank you. Oh yes, microphone, please.
Good evening, good Cavell, but I've thought this is a little bit outdated, so I'll go with good evening. I have some notes, and forgive me for reading some of my notes, but I had an epiphany and decided to change everything an hour ago, and but I promise you it's all from my heart. So I just would like to start by saying what a privilege it is to be here, to attend this event today, and spend time and interact with my colleagues and speakers today. I learned so much from you all over the years. And from those, for those that I didn't get to meet, my name is Sueli Castro, and I'm the founder of the platform Quit Like Sweden. So inspired by the progress of Sweden towards a smoke-free future and my personal story, as a daughter of a father that is a very heavy smoker, I embarked on a professional and personal mission. And last month, at the same time, with some of you that are present here today, I launched the platform Quit Like Sweden. My goal is to empower people, not only in my country, Brazil, but around the world, to regain control over their health. And I truly hope to experience a future where we prioritize saving lives from smoking-related disease and offer smokers, like my father, a chance to access alternatives to smoking so they can at least have a say on how they tackle their own dependence to cigarette. So for centuries, people have smoked. For decades, government around the world have tried to get people to stop smoking. But as Dr. Fasalino said, are countries really trying to stop people smoking when they ban alternatives and they have to resort to the most lethal form of consuming nicotines? I have seen that as well in my country, the same as the examples he gave in Indonesia and in India, where you ban and then those products are everywhere. I went to the markets where there were shop after shop selling vaping products that nobody knows where it came from. I mean, we have a hint, we think it's from Paraguay, but I didn't say that. But today, smoking rates remain high. As we've seen in the report, 1.1 billion people continue to smoke. And there is an overwhelming chance that they will die sooner or later of some form of tobacco-related disease. But it's not just death that is waiting for them. I'm being very sad now. But it's the poor quality of life of each smoker affects families and entire generations. Let's not forget this. They are not just sad statistics, they are the center of other people's life. During my childhood and youth, I witnessed what a life is of a father who leads cigarette after cigarette. So from an early age, I understood the limitations that tobacco addiction can impose on the family life of the people who smoke. On a more positive note, as I'm a positive person, like Bengt, I can finally see light at the end of the tunnel for millions of smokers, and I can see hope for those families. Today we heard time and again, and saw in the report discussed here, something many of us has been arguing repeatedly. The answer to help smokers to reduce smoke-related disease and death is to provide them with proper, safer alternatives, like Sweden did. And we just need to walk the street of this wonderful city and see it for itself. Just yesterday, I sat down beside a lady on the plane, and she had panic of flying. And then I looked at the table. She had a kind of pouch to help her through. And I thought to myself, how wonderful that she was able to access this product, afford it, and it is acceptable to her as a unique individual that we all are in terms of preferences, of flavors, of nicotine strength, and also that she doesn't have to feel that she's done something illegal or that other people will react negatively to it. So Sweden's approach to the fight against cigarette has been nothing short of a remarkable achievement, in my humble opinion. And if I was to wish for a miracle, I wish that other countries would be able to consume nicotine the same way Sweden does and save millions and millions in the process. But as I'm a doer and known for embracing challenges, Quit Like Sweden, or QLS for short, has big ambitions. The platform aims to encourage, assist, and enable other countries to reproduce exactly that, the Swedish experience. It's basically a hub for cooperation, so policymakers and governments, NGO, media, in fact anyone who would like to know more about it can understand how Sweden did and can try to replicate that in their respective country to fulfill the same mission. Because by now, it's clear, we must complement all those familiar cessation measures with other policies that can enable smokers to switch to safer alternatives. Like Fasalinos again said, you know, I'm loving you today, so I'm citing you a lot. The science is clear, and those products are viable alternatives, so long as, like Dylan and Frederick said, they are acceptable, accessible, and affordable. So please join me and let's make cigarette history, because to me, it's an honor to work with all of you and other colleagues and friends around the world to try to achieve this goal. So thank you for having me, and let me tell my story. Thank you.
I'll come up. Right. Thank you very much, Sueli, for that exciting update. So, to conclude the event today, which we're now at the end at, the key message is that despite the fact that Swedes use equivalent, on average, levels of nicotine compared with other EU countries, their tobacco-related health outcomes are significantly better because smoke-free nicotine alternatives are allowed by the government and are more widely used instead of cigarettes. So you can access the full report and the executive summary on smokefreesweden.org and thr.net. We would like to thank our authors and speakers, so please give them a round of applause. They've worked very hard. And thank you for contributing your valuable comments on the report, and thank you all for tuning in to our session today to learn more about the misperceptions of nicotine and about Sweden. So thank you very much, and see you next time. Let me just use this. Does this work? Hello? Hello? It's come off now. For those who want to stay for drinks, please do so. If you speak to my colleague Lucy at the back, who will take you to the rooftop bar for drinks and canapes for about 30 to 45 minutes. And any journalists in the room, if you wish to speak to any of our speakers, please again speak to Lucy to arrange those interviews. Thank you very much. See you soon.